All right, welcome to Module 2. There's going to be two videos in this module. The first is going to deal with human population and how we see that in the environment. And the second one that you'll go to after this will deal with issues of culture and region and economics. So let's get started with this. And remember that geography is a study of what's, phenomena, where's, the distribution, and why's, process. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about, in a sense, that most basic of human phenomena, and that is simply where people are. How many people, where they are, and why the numbers look the way they do. So let's get going with this then. So again, in this module, and again, it'll accompany your text reading, we're going to begin with excuse me, the world population. We're going to look at some numbers there. And then we're going to look at how population changes. And in that, what are those measures? So we're going to get through that. And we're going to look a little bit at migration. We're going to talk about really what that means and the ways that we understand migration. Introduce population pyramid, which is a graphic representation of population in a location. And then briefly, we're going to talk about urbanization and what that really means. All right, so let's get started. All right, so by the numbers, we want to think about this. It's kind of an amazing idea that there are over 7 billion people on the planet today. As of this week, the estimate is somewhere around 7.25 billion people. And again, to put that in perspective, the United States has roughly 320 million people. And as we move through the semester, you're going to see the different countries and regions and how populations are distributed. But population counts are just that, the number of people in a country. And so if you look at this, these are the top 5 countries. And I think what's worth noting is that the Asian regions, again, have by far the largest share of the world's population. China and India alone accounting for almost 2.5 billion people. In fact, estimates put it slightly over that. Again, put that in the perspective of the United States, very large country, but relatively low numbers of people when you compare it to China or India. And then Indonesia, an island archipelago, and Brazil kind of rounding up the top 5 at over 200 million people each. So we see this range of values, and you have these two countries at the top, India and China, that are far larger than anywhere else in the world. And then you'll notice that the countries now then come into the 1/3 to 1/4 billion people, and then many countries are well below 50 million people. So again, quite a bit of diversity in that. All right, so numbers are sometimes insufficient, though, to understand kind of how people exist in space. So the next idea, and again, one that will show up on your reading quiz, is the idea of population density. Population density is simply the number of people per unit area. Excuse me for this cough. And what that really means is we're talking about the number of people per square kilometer. And we have to be a little careful with that because it is somewhat sensitive to how the data is collected. And you'll see this in your story map, that if we estimate the density by country, we're going to get one way of looking at it, kind of very general. And then what you're looking at here is a much more detailed examination of what we call gridded population density data. And as your text notes, there are really 3 core areas of high population density. And that is, if we kind of look at these, you'll see the first one here is in eastern China, where the vast majority, you notice China extends well in this direction, but almost all of China's population is in the eastern half of the country. And then we see the second population density core, which is in the northern portion of India, and that's along what's called the Ganges River, right through here, the Ganges Brahmaputra Irrawaddy complex. But very, very high population densities here, well over 250 people per square kilometer. And then the third is this Western European core. And again, we notice that that extends from the United Kingdom into continental Western Europe. Now, those are the big 3 that the text talks about, but I do want to focus on 3 others that are, in some respects, both emerging and declining. So let me explain what's going on here. So if we look at West Africa, what you'll notice is this is an emerging core of high population density centered in Nigeria. And this is an area where population density in West Africa is rapidly increasing. Now we can also notice another kind of and we'll talk about this when we get into the sub-Saharan African region. You'll notice there's also this kind of high population density area here, and that's in the Rift Valley, but it doesn't spread from there. It's very, very localized. The other two that I want you to think about are the growing areas here. This is centered on Mexico City, and that's kind of the center of Latin American population density. And then we have the North American megalopolis, and you can see this here. It's a corridor that essentially extends from Boston down through Washington, D.C. The difference, though, is that this corridor is not growing to any great degree. It's a rather stable population density zone. Mexico City is certainly growing, but it's growing at not the same rate that we might see in terms of the Nigerian growth rates. And then when we look at the European density area, it's actually an area that's stable, and the overall population of the region is declining from natural forces, but there is some growth due to immigration. And that's one of the real challenges that we'll see in terms of migration later on when we look at Europe. Okay, so when we talk about population, excuse me, we can talk about where people are, but then change in population is really kind of a simple idea, but it's a very important idea in terms of human geography. And so if you think about it quite simply, we can talk about population change as simply births, number of births in an area, minus the number of deaths in an area, add people that are immigrating, that is coming into an area, and subtract those that are leaving, emigrating from an area. Now if we take the first two, births and deaths, that is what's going to give us our rate of natural increase. And again, births and deaths we're going to see as crude birth rate, number of births per 1,000 individuals in a population, and crude death rate, number of deaths per 1,000 individuals in a population. We refer to those as CBR, crude birth rate, and CDR, crude death rate. And remember, these are rates per 1,000. Most of the time when we talk about the rate of natural increase, though, we talk about it as a percent. So if births and deaths are per 1,000 and rates of natural increases are percents, we have to simply divide it by 10. So we'll often see it done that way. Net migration, another measure of population change, is the relationship between immigration and emigration. In this way, we add, in other words, you take the total immigrants into an area and you subtract those that are leaving, and that will give us our net migration. If there's more coming in than leaving, we have a positive net migration. If there's more leaving than coming in, we have a negative net migration. The last factor that we often will talk about in terms of population change is not simply births, but fertility rates. Now, fertility rates are the number of births on average that a woman will have in her reproductive lifetime within a population. So, for example, it might be 3 children per woman, or 2 children per woman. Or it can be less than 2 children, it can be 1.5 children. Anything less than 2.1 means that the population is decreasing based on fertility. In other words, in order to balance out, you have to have 2.1, slightly more than 2 because of natural infertility per, in a sense, couple. And so that's where we get that number from. All right, so let's take a look at these. The crude birth rate ranges from a high of approximately 45 to a low of 12 per 1,000 individuals. And one of the things that you'll notice is that the world regions really very starkly divide based on birth rates. You'll notice that Europe has extremely low birth rates. You can see all those through here. And again, right here, France is just barely into the next category at about 13. Then Asia falls kind of into this middle zone, and then Latin America and South America, again, in kind of these middle zones, and then sub-Saharan Africa has extremely high rates of births. And so birth rates are a good way of kind of understanding broad breaks in population. But again, we're going to look at that in a little more detail. Death rates look very different. And again, I'm going to go back and forth. I want you to see the distinction here. one would think that the most developed countries, most financially affluent, if you will, would have relatively low mortality rates. And in this sense, what we can see is birth rates are, in fact, somewhat tied. They're fairly well tied to economics. Death rates, though, are a little bit different. And you'll notice there's some kind of oddities that happen here. You'll notice that, oddly enough, the United States and Canada have relatively moderate, in fact, they're not quite as low as Mexico and Central America. So our death rates are slightly higher than some parts that have lower economic status than us. And that's kind of an interesting issue. Why is the death rates that way? And we can look at a couple of the affluence issues as well as the life expectancies. But what we can see here is that clearly sub-Saharan Africa also has very, very high death rates, which means that with high birth rates and high death rates, there's not a lot of change in the population. In contrast, let's look at Russia. Russia has extremely high mortality rates. Their death rates are very, very high. And in contrast, their birth rates are extremely low. So in the case of Russia, its population is actually declining rather rapidly. And so that's an important idea to think about. Okay, so birth rates, death rates, which lead us to this rate of natural increase. What you'll notice is that, again, the United States and most of Western Europe essentially are at between zero, in other words, stable population, and very, very slow growth, less than 1% a year. And then you have the areas of Central America and South America where they're growing at between 1 to 2%, a little bit less than 2% per year for most of the countries. And then you have sub-Saharan Africa again, which has extremely high rates of population growth based on natural increase. Now remember, natural increase is simply births minus deaths. When we look at some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and some of the countries in South and Central America, their rapid population growth is offset by considerable out-migration. So we have to kind of take into account those contrasting factors, or those factors that kind of counterbalance each other. Very high rates of growth are often coupled with fairly high rates of out-migration or emigration. All right, so now we look at actual growth rates, and this is including all of the factors. And again, what you'll notice is that for the most part, North America and parts of Latin America and South America essentially are relatively stable when we take all the factors together over the next 40 years. Europe, in contrast, is either stable or, in the case of many countries in Europe, actually declining. And we'll see later on when we talk about Europe that that's actually not necessarily a good thing. Then, when we look at the African states, again, we see population growth rates of less than 2% for some of them, again, somewhat based on outmigration, offsetting their natural rate of increase. And then we also have in extreme southern Africa, we have the implications of disease, high or increasing mortality rates. And so we can put all these things together and see that the world, in terms of our regions, is broken up into relatively stable regions in terms of population change, areas of substantial decline in population, and areas of significant increase. All right, so those are the ways we want to look at that. Now, let's take it a little bit further and let's take a look at what's happening in terms of that individual fertility, if you will. Now remember that when we talk about total fertility, of course, we're not really talking about every single woman, we're talking about the average. And the main thing that I want to point out here is that when we look at sub-Saharan Africa today, essentially in the last half decade, what we see is that many of these countries have fairly high fertility rates. And to give you a perspective on what these colors mean, the orange colors exceed 5 children per woman. The yellow is between 5 and 5.5, and that orange is 6.5 to 7. Now, that level of fertility is extremely high and causes very rapid population growth, almost no matter how high the mortality rates are. But what you'll notice then moving forward is that most of those countries in sub-Saharan Africa begin to fall rather dramatically, or at least we predict that they'll fall rather dramatically over the next 2 decades. And that's largely due to opportunities for women professionally and in economic sectors. And so we can see that, generally speaking, most of the models suggest that population growth is going to decline overall globally over the next 40 years and will essentially reach equilibrium by 2050. In other words, population of the world won't grow much past that time. Now, that doesn't mean that the population isn't going to move around, and that's what we mean when we talk about net migration. Now, we think about all those countries that are essentially stable in population, and what we'll notice here is that if you look at the map, most of the countries fall into this light, and again, if you look, we're going to kind of tie these two, look at these two light colors here, and that's most of sub-Saharan Africa, most of Asia, and most of South America have slightly negative migration rates, whereas Western Europe, Australia, parts of Southern Africa, and North America have rather strong positive migration rates. Now, I wanted, and I used this in the last lecture, but I want to open it up and look at it in a little more detail, and that is the dynamic migration map. So let's take a look at that. And again, what this map shows is blue dots indicate positive net migration, red dots mean negative. And it's fairly easy, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, it's fairly easy to see that most of South America, as an example, many of these states are out-migrating, but at the same time, there's some pretty strong cores of in-migration. I'm just going to choose Argentina here, and you'll see kind of what's happening. Argentina is a net immigration, in other words, it's growing here, and that in large part is because its economy is fairly strong and it has a fairly stable government. Those are two things that really lead to positive net in-migration. You also notice that some Argentinians, though, are outflowing to the United States, to Mexico, and to Canada. A large inflow from Spain, and then a slight outflow to, for example, Great Britain, and to, in this case, we can kind of see it going to Switzerland there. But let's flip this around and take a little bit of a different tact on this, and I'm going to look at, in this case, France. Now, France, again, is a positive in-migration, but in this case, you'll notice that France has a significant North African immigration core. And that is an important issue, and in fact, it's one of those that we'll see later on that is impacting policies in Western Europe, and especially in France. And I'm going to click on Italy now. And what you're going to see in Italy is that, again, Italy is an out-migrator right now, but you'll notice that it's also having a fairly substantial amount of immigration, again, from Eastern Europe. And so if we look at all of the countries in Europe, we're going to see that they have net migration dynamics. They have issues associated with them. Now, the last one we want to look at is, of course, the United States, and we'll kind of see where we're getting. The United States is the largest net immigration area. In other words, we receive the largest number of people in the world. When you look at this, kind of put this in perspective, there's many that are close, but we are by far the largest positive net migration. Not only that, but we are the largest net migration from a wide range of areas. You'll notice that in this case, we're getting a massive number of people from all over the world. And oftentimes, of course, in the U.S. policy right now, of course, it is the Central American and Mexican migration that's in the news. But the reality is that most of the world tends to send more people to us than we send abroad. Now, it is true, you'll notice over here, there are a few cases where we actually have more going away from the United States than to the United States. You'll notice these blue dots here. So again, net migration is kind of the reshuffling of world populations, and that's important to understand. Okay, so again, births, deaths, immigration, emigration. Lastly, I do want to talk about the idea of how we understand a population in a country. And the way that we do that most often is through what we call population pyramids. And again, these are from your text, and we're going to look at another site here real quick. But the easy thing to understand about population pyramids is, in general, they are a way of describing, if you'll notice at the bottom, it's typically a percent of the population, although sometimes it will be total numbers. And then each of the horizontal bars is the male and female population within an age cohort. Right here we have the age cohort. And so, in other words, what this is saying is that for Egypt, the largest percent of the population exists between the ages of 0 and 4. And then again, not surprisingly, the smallest percent of the population is way up here over 85. Now, most of the time, the pyramid is relatively well-balanced male to female. Notice Egypt and Iran. Here in the United Arab Emirates, you'll notice this very lopsided percent right here. And what's happening here, interestingly enough, is that in the United Arab Emirates, these are guest laborers. These are men, almost exclusively, that are coming into the country to help with physical labor. And in most of this, it's construction labor. Relatively affluent society, a big bulge there. Now, the bulge has increased on the female side, but again, this is largely domestic workers from, in most cases, from Yemen. And so again, population pyramids help us describe a population, not just by a number, but by sex, biological sex that is, and by age. So let's take a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. All right, so what I want to do, here's the United States. And in the United States, when we look at our pyramid, you'll notice that, and it's giving total numbers plus percentages here, the U.S. population pyramid is more or less stable. In other words, it's very similar in all of the age cohorts until, again, death begins to be a factor here and it shrinks towards the top. So if you see the sides essentially being even, that means it's a population that's relatively stable. Now let's contrast that. I'm going to pick out Germany, again, a nice European country, and what you'll notice is that in Germany, the bottom is much smaller than the shoulders. And again, we often talk about the feet, the hips, and the shoulders. And so what this means is that in the case of Germany, their largest percent of their population is up in the upper Middle Ages, that is between about 45 and 60. And not only that, but there's not enough children to replace this. And so the population is going to, not surprisingly, decline over time. This line here shows population over time for Germany, and it's going to start going down, 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 down over time. So an inverted pyramid shows a declining population. Now, if I take, for example, Guatemala, we're going to see just the opposite. This is what I call an arrow population. And that means, again, a growing population. You'll notice that right now, population in Guatemala is going up, and it's going to be going up for quite a while. When it begins to flatten out, I'm going to kind of change Guatemala to what we expected about 2100, and you'll notice, again, it gets straight on the sides. That's a stable population. So population pyramids are a way of describing a population. Okay, last idea. We want to talk about urbanization. And again, what urbanization really means is the description of how many people in a population reside in areas of high population density and are not associated with agricultural production. And what you'll notice is that, not surprisingly, the United States and Western Europe have very, very high levels of urbanization. The percent urban by country is very, very high. Now, what we saw already when we talked about the density of populations is that that's also fairly uneven. What we're going to do when we talk about urbanization, the more people move to urban areas, the more people are working outside of agricultural production, which means that people are not making or producing what they need. They're producing aspects of the economy that, when we'll talk about this later, areas of secondary, tertiary, and quaternary economies. That is, everything from manufacturing all the way up to research and development. In your exercise for this module, okay, we are going to, and I'm going to open this up in terms of the story map so we can look at these pieces. What I'm going to ask you to do is to move through, again, a series of these data sets and answer some questions for them. So these are the same kinds of things that we saw in the lecture, But this is your story map, and you, in this case, again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tabs that I want you to explore. Population totals, talk about that. And then population density. Now, the reason I'm introducing this one at the end of this lecture is that this way of looking at population density categorizes population density based on urban percents. And so if we look at the United States, anything that's purple, anything that's gray means very, very sparsely populated, or there aren't people there. But when we look at, and we're going to kind of pick out Pittsburgh here, you'll notice here's Pittsburgh right there. And I just want to use this as an example. What you'll notice is that if we look at light urban, urban, and heavy urban, are those orange colors there. And if we zoom into Pittsburgh, what you'll notice is that quite a bit of western Pennsylvania is actually still somewhat rural, the darker purple, which we call settled, still, excuse me, still what we would not consider urban. But then that urban component of Pittsburgh extends quite a ways out. And so in the United States, we have cores of urbanization. So when we look at Pittsburgh, we essentially have those areas of high density surrounded by relatively open space. So again, for this exercise, please note each of these has a different component, and I'm going to ask you to be looking at these at both the country level and, in the case of population density, at a smaller scale. So that's your story map for today. It links to these components in the first module, first 2.1 lecture. 2.2 is going to deal with culture. There will not be a story map associated with it. So we'll see you in the next lecture.